All right, I promised you a story in two main parts. And I would begin my story by just drawing kids like I would for a children's chat. Let's have a conversation. Come here. Let me tell you a little story. I'm going to take you back in time where there was no 4-lane interstate highways. I'm going to take you back in a time where there were no automobiles. Take you back in time where there were no airplanes. There was no television, no radio. There was a time when everything was very raw. And life could be very difficult. It was a time when ships moved by the power of the wind and the skillful use of the sails, the aerofoil of the sail. It was a time when there were no caterpillars or tractors, backhoes, and earth movers. There were horses and mules and oxen and hard men, hard women who knew how to survive in a world where life could be tough, very tough. My story is the story of Barnabas Douglass. We're going to get to the Thomas Meade Douglas story, but you have to understand a little bit of what all was behind that story. What was the background behind it? What was the joy that brought that life into the context of what happened? And starting with Barnabas Douglass, to the best of my understanding, history tells us, oh, by the way, this story was recorded in a book called My Friend the River, and so it's not something that I made up or spun out of whole cloth somewhere. Barnabas Douglass came from Dublin, Ireland, he and his wife, somewhere in the very early 1800s, somewhere around 1814, 1815. I haven't been able to tie it down any closer than that, but he came into the port of Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was a very interesting city at that time. Its primary function was shipping. It had a tremendous shipbuilding operations going on, and a tremendous fleet of ships, and some of the more famous ships that were ever in our history as a nation came out of the shipbuilding operations in Philadelphia. In order to build those ships, they needed materials. Well, life had been around in Philadelphia. Settlers had been in there for well over 100 years. And so they had taken many of the big virgin timbers out of the timberlands along the rivers of Philadelphia. Now, let me explain. Rivers were highways. If you wanted to talk about a main passageway, you didn't talk about a trail that a horse could walk down just wide enough for a horse and rider to walk through. You really didn't even talk about a path wide enough to take a wagon or a buggy down, and it certainly wasn't 2 lanes wide. It was only 1. But the main transport was by waterways, and the waterways were natural by and large. Once in a while you would find in a large city they would dig a canal so that they could move things horizontally back and forth off the river itself, but primarily it was the flow of a natural river. And so if you wanted to take Interstate 75 or Interstate 95 or Interstate 10, you got in a boat and you went up the river. Okay? Because there wasn't any other way to really get there very, very easily. So Barnabas Douglass was trying to find a way to make a new life in a new country. And the buzz of the city of Philadelphia was, we're having trouble getting materials. We have all this industry, but you have to understand the thing that drove the ships in 1800 and 1215 were these gigantic, straight as an arrow tree trunks that they would send down the river, and they would stand them up in the middle of this construction they were making of a ship as a mast to hold the sails as high up in the air as they could make the arrangements. And so these straight, tall trees were at a premium price. They paid amazing money for these trees that were going to become the masts for sailing ships in the early 1800s. There were no engines, there were no steam locomotives, there were none of those things that could drive a ship without the power of the wind. It was simply necessary to get the sails as high up in the air and as strong and held as solid as they could in order to catch the wind. And every once in a while there'd be a big storm and ships would be brought back into the harbor with the masts all broken off because of the gusts of the wind, and it was so too much for the trunk of the tree that they had used as the mast, and it would break them off. The spars, the bars, everything up in the sail mechanism of the ship required virgin lumber straight as a die. The only place that came from was places where the compact formation of the trees in the forest had caused all the strong hardwood trees to shoot as high up as quickly as possible to get on top of the cover, the crown of the forest, to be able to get up there to get at the sunlight. And so these trees would grow very straight, very tall, very fast, trying to get the top of the leaves to break through the canopy of the forest so that they could catch some of the sunlight. Well, okay, now you take a boat and you go up the river, and you look around, and all the big trees have been cut down, dragged over to the river, and dropped into the river and floated down the river to the shipbuilding enterprise. The problem that means is if you go far enough back sideways off of the river channel, it gets really hard to get these tall trees cut, cleaned up, and brought over and dropped in the river. So they had gone as far up the river as they could. They've gone as far sideways as they could to find all the lumber that was available for these large sailing vessels, and they had run out. They'd gone as far up the river as they could go. And most of the great, gigantic trees that was necessary for the mast and the spars and all the big heavy equipment on these sailing ships had been brought down to the river, and they had already been used. Now you have trees that are bent or crooked or too many branches coming off, and there wasn't the strength of this long, steady trunk. So Barnabas Douglass and his family moved up the river as far as they could. They came to a place called Cherry Tree in Pennsylvania. Named that way because there was an island in the middle of the river right there, and on that island, too small for anyone to live on, was this beautifully formed, perfect cherry wood tree. And so it was called Cherry Tree. And it was right in there along that river that Barnabas Douglass began to set about making a contribution to his community. He wanted to do something to be a blessing, to be a benefit, an encouragement to the community. So he realized there were several needs But the farmers in that area had no place to turn their grain into flour, so he knew something about that work, and so he set aside a section along the side of the river, and he set up a water-powered grinding mill to mill flour into something you could use to bake with, to cook with. And so that was the way he started back in the early 1800s. He made a mill to grind grain into flour. That little place is called Garman's Mills, and Garman's Mill. And that's the way he got started. But he was always interested in this very difficult challenge. How do you get materials for the shipbuilding? Okay, now, this is where my friend the river comes in, because there was a man, an engineer, had an engineer's brain, who came up the river and hooked up with Barnabas Douglass and said, let's go find some more of that timber. There's some pretty good money to be made if we can get that timber down to Philadelphia. So they went on up past the navigable waters of the river and up over the continental pass of the mountains, and they started looking out in there, and they found a wonderful treasure trove of lumber, natural grown forests with huge hardwood trees, wonderfully fertile, flat, fairly level ground, so they didn't have to worry about big logs rolling down mountainsides or trying to pull them up steep grades of sharp mountain passes. But the problem was they were on the other side of the continental divide. All the rivers, instead of running toward Philadelphia, ran down toward the Ohio and out to the Mississippi and to New Orleans. That was taking them the wrong way. It took them away from the places where the people were willing to pay for this prime lumber. So Barnabas Douglass and Tom Long discussed the problem. Now, there were a lot of things going on in those early 1800 years. There were things happening that were opening up more and more territory for people to settle and to be involved in. So there were people who realized that if you wanted to carry heavy loads, hooking a team of horses to a wagon wasn't the best way to get great heavy loads from one side of the mountain to the other. They realized that it was going to take something like a locomotive that would run on rails. But the locomotives weren't very powerful back in those days. They lacked the kind of horsepower that eventually became a part of industry in that time period. By the time we got to the 1860s, where the time of the Civil War, railroads had just pretty much honeycombed the whole area with tracks that would lead from one major city to another, and locomotives and rail traffic had become sort of a common transportation issue. But in the early 1800s, they were very rare. And so you had to figure out how these very weak, slow locomotives could pull heavy loads. So what the engineers did in the transportation industry, the railroad industry, what they did was they sent out surveyors. They sent out surveying teams, and they went all over the mountainsides. They looked at everything all over, and they found that if you could get a gentle slope of about 5 degrees of pitch slope, a locomotive could find its way, could have enough power to climb up that slope carrying a heavy load. And so the surveyors were always watching for the elevation to see what path they might be able to find. And it meant that you had to curve and twist and follow the contour of the mountainside. So it wasn't like a straight line like we have highways today. It was more like a cow path where you had to kind of twist around through all the different humps and bumps of the mountainside, but consistently looking for a 5-degree, no more than a 5-degree pitch. Well, at that point, the engineers had pretty well worked out a pathway through the mountain passes, through the mountain to high peaks, and you weren't going to go all the way up to the top of the mountain. You were going to stay in the places where it was down low. The altitude was as low as possible, and they had worked out this system where they thought the railroad could get up the mountain, through the pass, and down on the other side. But they hadn't laid any track down, and they hadn't done anything to actually put the railroad together yet. They had just surveyed the path that it would have to take in order to get on that incline. So Tom Long, Barnabas Douglass sat down, and they laid out a tract of land that they called the Tom Long Choppin'. The Tom Long Choppin'. And here's what they did. They engineered an arrangement with the railroad company to borrow, to use. I'm sure there was a monetary reward to the railroad company, although I don't have the documents to verify that. But the railroad had done the survey work. They knew the pitch, they knew the requirements had been fulfilled, and they were going to build the railroad eventually. So Tom Long asked for permission along that pathway, along the side of where the railroad tracks were going to go, to dig a ditch, kind of a shallow bowl of a thing, just about the size of a barrel, an old oaken barrel, a 55-gallon barrel, for those of you who do not understand what an oaken barrel is, about a 55-gallon barrel. And they did that all the way along the railroad, up the grade, through the mountain pass, and down the other side, down to the source waters of what would be the river that would take them down to Philadelphia. The little place where they decided to build that little headquarters, that headwater, was called Cush Cushion. The creek was called Cush Cushion. Interesting names. And how would they use that? So here's what they did. They went to the Tom Long chopping and they harvested the trees, these big, straight, tall oak, hickory, maple trees, tall and straight, very valuable to the shipbuilders. Ash, very strong lumber. And they would clean off all the branches and drag them over to the railroad right-of-way and pile them up all summer long. They would harvest the trees. They didn't take all the trees. They didn't do clear cutting. They took all the big, giant, native, virgin timbers and took those valuable trees and very carefully felled them and cleaned them and took them down toward the railroad. Now understand, this is down the mountainside from where they had to go. So they're piled up in a pile down there along the railroad. When the first frost of winter came, when the first freezing weather began to settle in, they stopped cutting trees. And they took the horses and the teams and all the things that they had been using to move the lumber back and forth through the summertime, and they hitched them to barrels, wooden barrels, filled with water that they had drilled holes into. And what the horses would do is they would drag those barrels down through that ditch that they had created, and the water would spill out through the holes, and the cold weather would form that into ice that would line the inside of that shallow groove along there, and it would make it into an ice sled track. And all winter long, they would hook teams of horses up to these gigantic trees that they had harvested through the summer and drag them down the ice channel all the way up the mountain, 5-degree pitch, all the way up to the top of the mountain, through the pass, and down to a place called Cushcushin. And in Cushcushin, the ice had completely formed over the river, and it was completely frozen over. You couldn't do anything. So they just piled them up in gigantic piles right there at Cushcushin all through the winter. As springtime came and their ice channel melted, and the horses would simply drag the timber a few yards and it would get mired down in the mud. They couldn't move them anymore. They just stopped. And the ice came out of the rivers, and they would slowly, gradually release some of them down into the river and form them into floats and float them as rafts down the river to Philadelphia. There was a lot of money to be made sending large timbers down the river toward Philadelphia. And they did a very nice work through a number of years trying to get these big, large native timbers down there so that the shipbuilding could continue. And the horses had enough strength that they could get them up that 5-degree slope and down and stored at Cushcushin until they could be floated down the river. Then they would go back to harvesting more trees through the summertime to get ready for the next fall, winter season. Okay, so that was the Tom Long chopping, and that was the genius of Tom Long and Barnabas Douglass, and they worked together as partners, and they made a great deal of difference in their community. It helped a huge amount. Very creative, very, very interesting dynamic. But what are you left with after you've harvested all of these gigantic timbers, gigantic native trees? Well, what you're left with is what is called a stump farm. A stump farm is nothing more than what used to be a forest that had been a fertile, wonderful floor of a forest, now covered by these gigantic stumps, sometimes 3-4 feet across, and then the roots that intermingled and went all around, and you couldn't do anything with the ground because there were stumps everywhere, completely covering the earth in that area. Well, you can't chew on a tree to make a living. You can't live by chewing on an old timber work. So you have to have a place to grow some crops. Well, the forest had been opened up, the sunshine was coming down, the ground was fertile, everything was right to make this into a beautiful farming area, except what do you do with all these gigantic stumps? And so the effort was made to dig around the stump, some area outside of the stump, say in a circle of maybe 10 or 12 feet. And as you dug down in these trenches, you would cut through the roots of that gigantic tree, and by the skillful use of horses and teams, you could work that stump up out of the ground as you cut more and more of the roots that you could expose and and you pulled it up and shook off the earth as it came up out of the earth, and you ended up with this gigantic wheel, 10 to 12 feet in diameter, as the stump was turned up on its edge. All the roots are cut off. The stump is sitting over here now. It used to be here, now it's sitting over here, and the roots are standing up this way. Well, what do you do with that? Well, the only place you could really use those stumps is if you got a team of horses and you rolled them like big wheels over to the side of the fertile ground that you had covered and over to the beginning of the woods that you had started to clear, and you made them into a stump fence. A fence made of the remains of the timber and the roots that extended out in all directions, that you could put them up side by side and make an entire surrounding fence around your field. And that was the way they began to farm in the area they had just taken the trees off of. And so individual places where the trees were very close together and very thick, they'd take the trees down, then they would turn the stumps on their side and began to build them into these stump fences, and what you were left with was an open ground that you could farm. Now, all of that took a tremendous amount of labor and horsepower, literally horsepower, and skillful use of leverage and manpower, because there were no hydraulic equipment. There were no big cranes or booms or anything else like that, so you had to do it by hand. The story is told that Barnabas Douglass let it be known back home in Dublin that he was doing well in this new land, and some of his family came to join him. Now, this is some of the attitudes and some of the stories of what it was like to live in this new land. And so Barnabas Douglass had a brother. I can't give you which brother it was, he had several, who came to this country and joined him there in the area in Green Township, Pennsylvania, close to Cherry Tree. And Barnabas Douglass realized that his brother needed to create his own support for his family. So he said to his brother, look, I will give you a choice, a little bit like what Lot was given when Abraham said, you take the low ground down there, the nice fertile area around Sodom and Gomorrah, I'll take the mountain ground, or either way, whichever you choose. So Barnabas Douglass gave his brother very much the same choice. He said, there's all this timberland that's still to be harvested, still good timber industry going on. The shipbuilding began to fade somewhere in the, I don't know, mid-1860s or whatever. The ships began to use steam power, and they didn't use the same wind power anymore. So it was, the industry was changing, but there were railroad ties that had to be made. There were all kinds of houses being built. There were all kinds of things using the timber. Different market, but the same kind of material. And so he said, there's all this timber industry we've got going over here, and here's the farms completely surrounded by stump fences that we've already cleared. So if you want to help us in the timber area, that's fine. And if you want to take the farm, you can do your farming over here. Well, his brother looked at the timber, and he said, that looks like a lot of work. That looks like a very hard life. I think I'll take what's already been cleared and I'll just farm the land that has been prepared and opened up. So he began to do the farming in the same area, same territory. Well, it wasn't too long after that that he came back to Barnabas and he realized he'd probably made a mistake. Barnabas Douglass was thriving in the lumber business. There was so much need for that timber. And all of those various lumber products, whether it's for shingles or whether it's for building materials to build a house, or, all of the industries that are being created, every business needed a building to work inside of. And then there was a third area that just began to come on real strong. In Pennsylvania, there's a lot of coal. And at first, they could just get the coal sort of from the surface, or just barely back in the hillside. They'd follow the vein of coal back in a ways. But coal comes in a soft rock formations. And so they couldn't go very far back into the mountain, and the softness of the rock above the coal would tend to cave in and cover up the coal again. And so if they wanted to do very much to get the coal industry going, the coal industry had been the driving force for all the locomotives and the rail industry and things. They needed to get this powerful fuel to places that needed it, including the shipping that was coming up, steam engines. So they came up with a plan so that they would take timbers and make supports that were just as high as the tunnel they were cutting into the mountain, the height of the vein of coal. They would take those timbers and make a roof over them, and they would literally build a tunnel of wood underneath the mountain to where they could get to the seam of coal that they were going to mine out. Well, where do you go to get lumber? I mean, it didn't take a genius to realize there's not enough timber right next to the opening of the mine to provide you much of a tunnel back in there. And if you've got miners, they're mining, not timber people. So you actually talk to people like Barnabas Douglass and say, what would it cost us to have you send us all these timbers that we can use to cover up the very risky mining operation and make our mines safer? And so Barnabas Douglass, ties for the railroad, lumber for the houses, businesses, and now in the coal industry. And as there became more and more coal-fired steam engines, locomotives, and shipping, the demand for this first-rate coal was really beginning to boom. Well, Barnabas was supplying that timber for those industries, and his brother looked at it and said, Barnabas, I think you tricked me. You didn't tell me that you were going to make all this money working in the timberlands. You stuck me with this farm that I can't make a dime on. I think you cheated me. I think you ought to split the profits you're making on the timber with me, even though I'm not working in the timber industry with you. And Barnabas Douglass looked at his brother, and very important, this is very important to remember. He looked at his brother and realized not that he had tricked him, not that he had covered up what was happening, but he had a compassion that went beyond his own needs and looked at the needs of the other. And Barnabas Douglass said, my brother, you are correct. I need to share some of the profits from this operation with you so that we can all do better. Now, Barnabas Douglass had a big family. Curly Bill was one of his boys. And he passed along not only his savvy for business, his skill, his desire, but he passed along a great deal of his philosophy of life. And as the generations came on down from Curlyville down to his son, John E. Douglass. But John E. Douglass was just as wise and just as well trained in how to take care of people. He had a large family. He was a well-to-do farmer, rancher, lumberman. He had a lot going on. Had a rather large house, a nice farm. He had a farm where, as he drove his buggy from town up into the driveway, there was a circle that came up right past the porch of the house. And John E. Was sort of a gentleman farmer. He was fairly well-to-do. He had some heart problems, but he was a wealthy man. He was so wealthy in proportion that he was able to provide each one of his children their own farm, their own source of income. So that was the source of what they were going to have as their inheritances. They were each given a farm, their own operation that they could run. And so he had his farm, but one of his possessions, one of his farms, was the original Barnabas Douglass home, the homestead that Barnabas Douglass had started. And so that was one of them also. But he would come into the driveway with his buggies. He came from town. And he would, almost like we would push a garage door opener today, and the garage door would come up so we could put our car away. He would do this thing where as he came in the driveway, he would go, whoop, 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 whoop. And men would come out of the barn. They'd come out of the stables where the horses and the carriages were, and they would take the horse and they would take the carriage. They would wipe down the carriage and put it away for storage until the next time he wanted to take it. They would take the horse. They would, the team, they would curry them all up, take care of them, get them fed and watered, and get them ready for the next time they were going to be used. And they were kind of his big surrounding of employees and hired hands that were very significant. There were several families all tied together there that would work on the John E. Douglass farm. And John Douglass married Drusilla Garman. Remember Garman's Mills? Well, the Garmans had become pretty wealthy people in their own right. Part of them owning a hotel and a meeting place was kind of not a hotel necessarily like we would think of it today, but it was like a place for people who were traveling who could stop as they came to the railroad and on the railroad and passenger lines and could stay, be fed, be taken care of, all those things until they made the rest of their journey on down through the train system. And so they had quite a meeting room. They had Sunday school classes for the kids on Sundays and things. They had all kinds of different things in the hotel that the Garman family had established. And so she came as quite a sophisticated lady at those days, and her name was Drusilla, but everybody called her Drusy. So Grandma Drusy was John E. Douglass's wife and was very, very influential in the family. The pictures we have of John E. and Drusilla, show him with always with a suit and a vest and a nice shirt, and he had a pocket watch. Nobody had wristwatches like this in those days. They had pocket watches, and because pocket watches tended to, be possibly of slipping out of your pocket doing your work and things, and would, tumble on the ground. Well, you didn't want this expensive instrument. I mean, everybody bragged about how well their watch kept perfect time. I mean, there were competitions. Every time you went to town, there was the courthouse clock. And everybody would take their pocket watch and say, "What time you got?" Going to compare whose timepiece was the most accurate. And the story is told of John E. Douglass, who had come into town, and it just so happened that the clockmaster in the county building had been doing some repairs or something on the clock, and he came down to the street. He said, "Hey, John, what time you got on your watch?" And John opened up his watch and told him the time, and the timekeeper went up and set the county clock, the courthouse clock, to exactly that time. Okay, so it isn't more than a few minutes later that, people coming back, "Hey, John, what time you got?" And he would reach into his pocket watch and flip the lid open, and it was perfect with the courthouse clock. Amazed everybody that there was no variation. It was exactly what the time on. He never told anybody. He had just had the clockmaker set the clock to his pocket watch. Anyway, there was a lot of competition. So there was always this sense of the people who were the wealthier, more well-to-do people always had these fine timekeeping instruments, and in order to protect them from falling on the ground, they were connected to a chain that was buttoned onto the other side of the vest. And this chain would, loop across the front of their stomach, across the vest, sort of an indication of your status in the community. And then he added one more thing. He was sort of famous for having had a cougar's tooth. The tooth of a cougar that had been, I don't think he gave it up willingly, but he had given a tooth to hang on John E. Douglas's watch fob so that he could show his unique character, having a cougar's tooth on his chain. So John E. Douglass, tremendous man. He has some heart problems. He struggles for a few years at the end of his life with congestive heart failure and some of those things. Well, it just so happens he also has a son named Barnabas Douglass. Now, he was actually named Barnabas Meade Douglass. Barnabas was a very well-respected name in the Douglass clan, as you might well imagine. But when Meade came to a certain age, he decided there were just too many Uncle Barney Douglasses running around that area, and that his identity would get all confused with all the other ones. And so he put his first name in the middle and took Meade, his middle name, as his primary name. So he became Meade Barnabas Douglass instead of the other way around. And he was one of the younger children of John E.'s family, and a bit of a character all in his own right. As John E. began to struggle with his health problems, he promised Meade, his son, to give him the deed to the old original homestead that Barnabas Douglass had begun. It was probably the most developed of all of the homesteads. It was probably had the largest facilities, the largest barns. It had been around for such a long time that it had a lot of outbuildings and a lot of ongoing things. So Meade had been living there in the Barnabas Douglass house through his married life as he was getting started. John E. promised him the old homestead for his inheritance. And it was only just 30 days before John E. passed away from heart problems that they completed the deal, and Meade Douglass became the owner of the old Barnabas Douglass homestead. Now, if you were trying to get a picture in your mind of this particular time frame, you have to get a picture in your head of the kind of environment they were in. They were far enough away from any kind of city that they were pretty much isolated and on their own most of the time. And they were always going into the city for shopping adventures and that kind of stuff, other business, but they were far enough away from any kind of municipality that they were sort of on their own. They lived along what had been, still was, a dirt road through the countryside, meandered around through the hillsides and up and over and around and down. It eventually became gravel, was highly traveled in one way, but it was about a mile or so away from the main road that was the first one to get blacktopped. It was the first one to get pitch over the top of it so that you wouldn't get muddy traveling on the main road. But the Barnabas homestead was along a road that was basically dirt and eventually gravel, but had everything you needed to survive, had everything you needed to be able to make a life. There were enough cattle on the premises. They raised enough cattle that they could have dairy products and all kinds of things that they could use for that industry, plus the meat that they would provide. They raised hogs. They would slaughter as many as 6 hogs at a time in the fall of the year, put the meat in the smokehouse, have pork and ham and bacon and that kind of stuff for the things. They had a whole orchard full of different kinds of fruits and berries and fruits and things that they could harvest. They canned dozens and dozens and dozens of quarts of all kinds of fruit from the gardens, from the orchards, from all that kind of, so they were self-sustaining. They had a house that had a kitchen and a dining area where this table was maybe 12 feet long. It was a long table, and people hired hands and all kinds of people that they would have living upstairs. The upstairs were bedrooms and many, many beds in each room, so they could have a dozen people sleeping upstairs that were either working for them or would spend most of the week there or would be in and out, traveling through, helping out for a while, then moving on down the road. So it was kind of like a hotel as well as a home. And so this was a house that was constantly moving with activity. It was as much like a ranch as it was a farm, because they would plow and prepare and grow the crops, sometimes to feed the animals, sometimes to feed the people involved, but there were all kinds of other activities going along. One of the favorite ones in my story was that they did a whole lot of training of horses. Even though there were automobiles coming on about the time Barnabas was involved, most of the work was still being done with horsepower. And so what he would do is he would travel farther west over into Ohio and different places and fill up a big truck full of wild horses that were untamed and bring them back. And his group of employees and hired hands became very expert managers of wild horse training facility. Then he would sell these trained horses that had been broken so that they could plow, they could pull the carts, they could, pull the buggies, they could do all these things. They would sell those to other people in the community that didn't have the skill or the time or the energy to break a horse and train one. In fact, the Meade Douglass group was pretty well known, very famous in the area. It just seemed like there wasn't any kind of a horse that they couldn't somehow train to become useful in some way. In fact, the story was told probably by people bragging more than they should have, making more of it. They said that Meade Douglass group could put a horseshoe on Satan himself if they could figure out how to get a rope on him. Now that was quite a big story, all right? But what my dad would tell, as he told about growing up on the ranch and the farm, was that they would take horses that had really strong personalities, really powerful animals, and by the skillful use of the team of workers that they had, they would break those horses down to where they became tamed and useful on the farms and could become something of value that they could sell to other farmers and people in need. They were good managers of their livestock. In fact, only one or two actually couldn't be broken, and the stories of those were the most painful of ones. There's a story of Dad called him a big roan, which means a big red colored horse that continually wanted to run away. They could train him to pull a plow. They could hook him up in the harness. They could get work done, and it wasn't too bad. He was a good, strong horse. But he had a wild streak they just couldn't seem to get rid of. And so my dad, as a young boy, a middle school type boy, they had finished using the horse in the field, and they said, okay, take the big roan back up to the barn. And they had a name for all the horses, but take the big roan horse back to the barn. So without putting a saddle on or anything else, just the harness with all of the collar and all the reins and everything, he just jumped up on top of this horse with all of that equipment on there and was going to ride him back up to the farm, up to the barn, be taken care of. And he'd no more than gotten started back toward the barn when that big old roan decided this was a time he could get free and run as far as he could go. And so right past the barn, up and over and across into the field across, and he was on his way toward the woods on the far side of the field across the road. Well, Dad, riding him as a boy, got a hold of the reins and was able to finally get him stopped and turned around before he got in the woods. Getting in the woods is a problem, because not only is there still remains of the stump fences all around you, and many years ago as that, it takes those things a long time to deteriorate, but all kinds of low-hanging branches, the horse knew he could knock Tom Douglass off of there if he could get in the woods. So Dad brought him around, brought him back over to the old gravel dirt road, and started bringing him back up the road toward the barn and the homestead. Well, he got a few yards down the road, and the roan realized he was headed back toward the stable, the stall. He didn't like that very good. And he took off again. Except this time, in order to throw Tommy off, everybody called him Tommy, even still to this day, and he went down in the ditch along the side of the road, and then back up, and all of that finagling, my dad slipped off. He slipped off, but he got tangled up in all that rigging, all that harness work and everything that was around the horse. And so there he hung, head down, underneath the front end of that horse, dragging on the ground. And the horse is running at full speed with his front legs battering and beating on the boy hanging underneath as he ran at high speed down the road toward the homestead. Well, somebody saw what the problem was and came running out on the porch. Whoa! "Oh, Tommy's in trouble." So the whole group came out there on the road, and they got the big roan stopped, and they unhooked Tommy's legs and everything, brought him up to the house, and he was pretty badly beat up, but he was still alive. And that's the story of the big roan horse. And he didn't stay around the farm very long. Meade was not inclined to leave anything dangerous around very long. Dad told the story of an old boar hog, an old male hog that had gotten kind of ornery, and at one point chased he and his sister Vivian across the farmyard, just snorting and running after him as hard as he could, teeth bare. He was going to take a big hunk out of him. And Vivian got to the fence first, and she jumped over the hog fence, and Dad got over just in time, just barely in time. And as he jumped over the fence head first, the teeth of that old hog, trying to get one last bite out of it, snapped together like wood cracking together as he snapped, and just barely missed the back end of Dad's trousers. So he's going to get a hunk out of the back end of his running gear over there. Well, that old boar didn't last very long, because it was going to be hog rendering day pretty soon, as he got himself taken care of. Meade wasn't going to put up with that. Okay, so Meade is one of the younger kids in the family. He marries this wonderful lady called Lucy Bell McDonald. And Lucy was one of the youngest kids in her family. She was, in some ways, her father's favorite child. We have pictures of her as a small girl being held by her father, William O. McDonald. She was a very special lady.